In the last section, we were able to successfully test out our fetch user action creator. We're now going to come back to this action creator and do a little bit of a refactor to it. At present, it's still making use of a promise that is being returned by axios.get. So remember, anytime we make a request, always returns a promise. We can get a little notification of when that request has been resolved by chaining on the .then. So at present, we're saying after this request has been resolved and we get a response back, dispatch an action containing that response. So payload of res right here. Now, the code that we have on the screen at present definitely works without a doubt. But when you really look at this thing, man, it is awfully ugly, isn't it? Like, the thing's just ugly. There's just so many lines to it. It's really tough to look at and get a very succinct understanding or a very quick understanding of what's going on here. So we're going to refactor this action creator to use the async await syntax instead. And simultaneously, we're also going to kind of use arrow functions in a slightly tricky way that's going to also kind of condense down this extra function here. All right. So let's get to it. We're going to do this refactor one step at a time. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the outside arrow function. So the arrow function that is being assigned to the fetch user variable. So here's the arrow function. We've got the argument list, we've got the arrow, and then we've got the inner curly braces. Inside the curly braces, we have a single JavaScript expression, which is to define a function. So we have got this single expression. As soon as we define it, we then return it. So the first little refactor we're going to do, we're going to exploit a little rule that exists around arrow functions. With an arrow function, if you have curly braces and the return statement is being used with a single expression, so in other words, there's like no other code inside of here, like say 1 + 1, equals the variable 2. So if we had this would be two separate expressions, but right now we just have one, right? So when you just have one expression, you can remove the curly braces and the return keyword, like so. So this code right here, completely equivalent to what we just have. We still have an arrow function that automatically returns the function that we define inside of here. So just to prove to you that it still works, I'm going to save this code right here. I'm going to save this file, and then we'll go test it inside the browser again. So I will go back over, I'll refresh, and yes, everything still works over here. Okay, so refactor 1, good. Now I'm going to take this function keyword that we defined, and rather than define a function keyword, we're going to return an arrow function instead. Okay, so this is really just purely stylistic, no difference between using a function keyword or an arrow function for this inner one right here. So rather than function keyword, I'll delete that. And then on the other side of the argument list, I'll put down my arrow like so. So now when I save this, well, actually I don't want to save it just yet because when I do, Prettier kicks in and it refactors everything. But if you just look at what I have on the screen right now, you'll see that I've got the argument list and then the arrow function body. Now when we just have a single argument, we don't need the dispatch, or we don't need the parentheses around that argument. So I'm now going to remove the parentheses. And then when you look at what I have on the screen now, well, I can really just move this separate function declaration up to the same line as the previous one. There's no reason I can't. So I'm going to take this, put it on the line right above it, and then I'm reduced to just what I have on the screen right here. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to test it inside the browser again, just to prove to you that this still works. So I'm going to go back over, I'll refresh the page, and yep, still have the action. So everything is still working. Now at this point, I want to say, yes, this code looks a little bit strange, but it still is 100% valid JavaScript. Now let's do the last refactor here, We still are making use of the .then statement in here, so we're still using promises. Rather than using .then and then having this like extra function in here, I want to use the async await syntax inside of this arrow function instead. So the last step to the refactor, we're going to find the function that is currently generating some async logic or generating a promise. We'll mark it as being async. We will then replace the actual promise with the await keyword and then finish the rest of the refactor, just like we did previously when we first learned about async await. So the function that contains a promise is this one right here. So right before the argument list, I'm going to place the async keyword. So I'll say async dispatch, like so. So async dispatch, I know this looks very strange to have the 2 words in a row. It might look a little bit more straightforward if I put the parenthesis on like so, but really no need for it, same thing. Now inside of the actual body, I'm going to find all the different promises and mark them with the await keyword. So I'm going to first condense this thing down to a single line and then say await axios.get. And then I'm going to replace this entire .then statement down here and assign whatever the actual request gets resolved with an assignment to a variable. So I'll say const res equals await axios.get. And then the last step, I can remove the entire .then statement and only keep around the actual body of the function, which is the dispatch statement. So I will remove the entire .then, and I'll make sure I clean up the extra parenthesis on the right-hand side too, like so. And then the very last thing, make sure I indent it correctly. And at the end of the day, we are left with just this right here. And so I'll save it. We'll go back over to the browser. There's the refresh. And yes, everything is still working the exact same way it was before. So pretty distinct change, right? Like that's quite the refactor. So to be 100% clear, everything we're looking at right here, 100% equivalent to what we had before. Like all of this, same thing. We are still returning a function that makes a request, and then only after the request is completed do we dispatch an action. We're just using a highly modified bit of syntax that really just cleans up the function, the entire action creator. So I think that personally, this is a lot easier to read. If you're sitting there thinking, Steven, you're crazy, this is definitely like absolutely not easier to read. Well, you know what? You are entitled to your opinion, and I don't disagree with you. The very first time you look at this compacted syntax, you're going to think to yourself, this looks weird. I'm not familiar with it. It makes no sense to me, so I don't want to use it at all. But I'll tell you what, I encourage you to use it. Just give it a shot. And after a little bit of time of working with this compact syntax, you will get used to it. So if it looks weird, it's just because you haven't seen it before. I encourage you, work with it a little bit. And as soon as you do, you're going to have a much better sense of what's going on here. Okay? Now, I want to say just one last like possible refactor. We could go like really overboard. So I'm going to like make a duplicate here and then do a quick refactor just to show you how deep we could really go. So I don't really need to assign the response to res. I could just take the entire request and then assign it to the payload like that right there. If I do this, I no longer need the actual semicolon at the end. I don't need I'm not returning anything from here, and I only have a single expression. So I can also delete the overall curly braces. And then when I save it, we get a little bit of an error message. So I probably made a little typo somewhere in here, but you know what, we'll just let that go. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that you can really take this and still like mess around with it a lot more than we have already, but you really don't have to. I encourage you to just say like, this is a good stopping point right here. That's all I'm really trying to say. Okay, so I think that this is enough. For all the other action creators we're going to write in this course, we're going to end up with something that looks pretty similar to this right here. So we will definitely get the opportunity to write many more action creators that look just like this. So with that in mind, let's take a quick break. We'll come back in the next section and continue with our application.